Hello, everybody. Welcome to Lunch and Lore. I'm Tormented by Gnomes. Joining me is NinjaManMat, co-creator of Anacra and wearer of hats. Matt, how are you today?
My hat is haunted, but I'm fine.
Yeah, it's a little bit haunted. So, if you're not familiar with the show, this is a 1 hour lore jam stream where we either make stuff up about the world of Anacra on the spot or share with you what we've been cooking up behind the scenes. We cover a different topic every single week. We try to keep things relatively well connected. If you're a member of the Casters and Castles Discord, if you hop into our lore channel, sometimes we take questions from chat. If you're in chat right now, sometimes we take questions from chat depending on how off base and tangented we feel like getting. So today's episode is about the moon slash moons. And the reason that there's a little bit of confusion there is that my original idea, we only had one moon, but thanks to this chucklehead over, okay, there we go on the interface. This chucklehead over here, we have at least two moons at this point. So first off, I think the most important thing to say is that because Anacra has this weird cosmology where the mortal world is, okay, the underworld is at the center of everything. The mortal world is on top of that. The other world is intermingled, overlayered with that. And then the overworld, the Sky Kingdom, is on top, around that like a bubble. And then at the very edge of that is the firmament. This is not a Copernican sort of cosmology. The sun orbits the Earth, stuff like that. So a moon has to be something different than what it is in our world in these cases. So
By
first,
the way, I'd like to point out the reason why I thought that we should have a different moon is that your moon ended up being made of blood and bones. And that is no moon.
that's a battle station. I don't think there's anything wrong with the moon in our world being completely different from everyone else's moons, for the
I
record.
think the biggest reason why I was thinking differently is that that means that there was no moon for at least 500 or plus more years
Mhm.
in the once we left the Dawn era. And I feel like that's missing something. I think we needed like an OG, even if it was just a very small, it serves to move the tides and do all the kind of stuff people are normally used to moons
Mhm.
doing, being pretty in the sky at night. You know, we went from having just inky blackness when there's no sun to, hey guys, there's a moon in the sky. By the way, if you know the lore, it's made of blood and bones
Yeah.
of demons.
Again, I don't really have a problem with that, but I'm also totally open to the idea of there being another moon. We've sort of hashed out another moon that can exist. But when we talk about moons, first off, we've established in our world that the stars are angels, they're celestials standing at the very edge of the universe, keeping watch over the universe and making sure that giant space fleas from nowhere aren't able to get into the universe. So, where are the moons? The moons are beneath the stars. They are inside the firmament of Anacra. And I think what we sort of come to agree is that they're in that border space between the Sky Kingdom, the overworld, and the firmament itself. So they're like above the Sky Kingdom, but they're not quite at the firmament itself. Does that track?
Yeah, I feel like they're in kind of like a weird, not quite a pocket dimension, but kind of a
A
border
border,
dimension.
yeah.
Talked about how there's 4 to 5 depending on what you know, separate kingdoms within an Anacra or realms, and that we have like the border ethereal, we have the astral leading out into the hungry dark. We've got lots of cool stuff that kind of layers on and
Mhm.
goes in between, but I feel like we've talked about there are like pocket dimensions of dawn that you can tap into, and while this is not that, I feel like the moons hold some weird space in between the rest. They're not
Mhm.
like, hey, go to Moonland and enjoy being in Moon Palace Place, but neither can you just hop into the Sky Kingdom and then go, hey, let's just take a quick bus trip up to the moon.
Yeah.
No matter where you are in Anacra, getting to the moon is not an easy thing.
Yeah, you can't just fly to the moon and let yourself play among the stars.
Gosh darn it. Ow, right to the moon,
Yep.
Joseph.
I knew that was going to happen. We're whalers on the moon. Okay, so we've established that the moon slash moons exist in that border space. Let's next talk about, and we're going to get to your questions in chat in a moment. Let's talk about the moon that we've already established in our lore. So when you look up at the sky in our world, you've got this big old white, gray, glowing ball of light. The equivalent in Anacra that is that bright is the blood moon. And we've talked about this in previous episodes, but for those of you just joining us, there was a period of time in Anacra when fiends, demons and devils and stuff basically took over the world. They were doing a very good job of running the mortal kingdom. And by running it, I mean running it into the ground. They were the predominant power. They were rampant across the world until Romius, one of the Titans, changed the rules of the universe, made himself overlord of the dead, and banished all the fiends to the underworld. The process of that banishing was, because the underworld metaphysically exists under the mortal world, they were all literally dragged screaming into the earth, crushed by this inescapable force, squeezed from their bones, and just, you know, into the planet. They would have turned into fossils, demon fossils down there, essentially, because of the way that they were smooshed into the world, except for the fact that later on, a giant abomination called the One Flesh was drawn to the smell of the dead Earth Sovereign and entered the Four Kingdoms and tried to burrow into the mortal world and the underworld to drink the lifeblood of the universe. The Sovereigns and Titans panicked, and they took the wellsprings of blood that normally arose from the underworld and gave life to new creatures, and they took all the bones of the fiends to make a protective solid shell around this giant ball of blood, and they yeeted that into the sky because the One Flesh was already on the mortal world, having the crap beaten out of it by the Sovereign of Water, and they wanted to make it difficult for it to get that blood. So they made the wellspring of life is no longer in the underworld, it's now orbiting the Four Kingdoms as a giant ball of bones with blood underneath it. So when you look up in the sky and you see the big shiny white moon, that's what you're seeing, is this orb of bones. And the surface of that, it's fairly large. It's not as big as our real world moon is by comparison, but it's fairly large. And the surface resembles a snowy forest. It's very cold, and it's got these weird bone trees growing out of it. And there's flurries of snow that's actually really cold powdered bone. And there are creatures that live there. A lot of wild fae dwell there. They found it to be to their liking. They have their hunting lodges there, and on cold winter nights they'll ride down shafts of moonlight to the mortal world to form wild hunts, to kill and hunt and drag people back to their hunting lodges on the blood moon. So it's not evil, but it's definitely dangerous, primal, and uncontrolled. That's the big one that you see in the sky. Did I miss anything about that?
No, I think you pretty much covered everything. It's a terrifying place if you ever were to go there.
Yeah. Super spooky. All right, so let's talk about other moons. Does the skeleton army sleep on the moon when it's not Halloween? Yeah, probably the skeleton air force is on the moon, the skeleton armies in the underworld. They divide and conquer. Do we want to take some questions from chat, or do we want to talk about other moons first?
I think it's a good idea. Let's bounce it and take a few, and then we can move on.
All right. Are either of the moons made of cheese? At this time, there are no moons made of cheese in Anacra.
We cannot confirm nor deny that there are any moons made of queso.
In any game where Moirai is playing, there will be a cheese moon, but outside of that, it's not strictly canon.
The Cheese Baron has a secret moon up in the Anacra orbit.
Exactly.
It's
more of a wheel.
Way up there.
It's just a wheel of cheese that floats up there. It's green.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. How many creatures live on the moons? Well, on the bone moon, the blood moon, lots and lots of wild fae dwell there. There's also some giants and other creatures that dwell there. You have to be a magical entity to live there because it's not a normal ecosystem, but there are plenty. Again, it'd be considered a very high level zone in an MMO to go there. Lots and lots of powerful, violent hunting fae.
This is the kind of place that if you really piss off a like neutral aligned or maybe even an unseelie fae, you might end up getting teleported up to the moon, and you basically spend out the rest of your existence getting hunted until eventually you either collapse from exhaustion or they find you.
Mm-hmm.
There's really no getting off there unless you do some kind of old heroic, I brought something with me that can help me get out, or I make a deal with or conquer the fae that are pursuing, something like that. You got to be clever and or prepared, and even then you're probably dead
or outrageously high level.
But even then, I mean, what are you going to do? Even if you got to be somewhat clever, even if you're outrageously high level, you kill everything, and then what? Now you're trapped on a bone meal moon. You know, what are you going to do?
Guess I'll grind these bones to make my bread. Do the moons?
Okay, actually, wait. Before we move on, there is something we probably need to, and we don't have to do it right now. We should probably discuss the blood within the moon, because unless you've changed the properties of why that's important, there was a reason why it was shunted into space, or at least, you know, above the actual plane of Anacra, and getting to that would be kind of important. So we'll come back to that, I think.
Yeah, it's the raw life energy. It's incredibly powerful. There are tales of heroes who have drunk directly from that wellspring, and they were infused with incredible power. So that's a thing that can happen.
And they may or may not have become vampires.
There is there's a lot of bone between like the surface and that blood, so it's not an easy task. Do the moons interact / affect the magical tapestry of Anacra? Yes, the blood moon is one of the main sources of blood magic. If you want to play a blood hunter in the world of Anacra, then you're going to definitely be tied to the moon, that moon. I imagine that when you're learning blood magic, you learn different, like you have to adjust the incantations and rituals and hand gestures you use based on the phase of the moon, where the moon is at, so on and so forth, because the moon is directly tied to blood magic, vital energy, that sort of stuff. Now, other moons, as we add them, the jury is not yet out on how many moons there are. We're sort of leaving that open right now. We're going to hash some of that out today, actually. But I think that every single moon would definitely be connected to a type of magic. So just to bring everybody up to speed, we're working on, and we're going to hash out during this luncheon lore session, a smaller moon called the Pearl, which in my head, at least superficially, actually resembles a giant shining pearl. And the pearl is tied to Liban and Vindur, primarily Liban. It is a smaller moon. It's very bright, but it's not, if you look up in the sky and you see the moon in our world, it's pretty big. This is much smaller, maybe a quarter of that size, but it's got this luminescence to it, and that is the moon that controls the tides. Because we don't have standard orbital mechanics, the tidal mechanisms in Anacra can't just be based on gravity, because our gravity does not follow real-world gravity at all. So instead, the reason that the tides ebb and flow is because they are drawn to the water magic in the Pearl, which is sort of a channel, a connection to the oceans of Anacra. We haven't done much more fleshing out of it than that so far, but my inclination, and this is something that Matt came up with, is that every moon, it has to be connected to a powerful entity or a titan or something for it to exist in the first place. And because the titans are tied into the elemental powers of Anacra, those moons would then govern magic in some other way. Any thoughts on that before I continue, Matt?
No, you basically covered everything, Joe. I feel like we spoke of before becoming the Queen of Stars, not Liban,
Realta. Yeah.
She was the one who controlled the moon, being the titan of both Vindur and Liban, sovereign of the skies and the seas, made her the perfect candidate to control the very first tide-moving moon.
Now, I like the idea that Realta, who's now the Queen of Stars, just like Ramius used to be the cupbearer of the gods, but he forsook those duties when he took on the mantle of being the overlord of the dead, I would imagine that Realta no longer has dominion over the oceans or the tides because she sort of forsook that role. It's not a hard set that has happened. She could still have control of the tides, which would then make the tides sort of a holy thing, like a maritime church would have some sort of celestial connection, which could work really well for the second day in our later lore, by the way. But it's also possible that when she became the Queen of Stars, she forsook the Pearl, and either it's ungoverned, which would fit Liban, who is this sovereign of freedom, very mercurial, very ever-changing, refuses to be bound, or somebody else could have stepped up and taken that role and now govern the tides, which could be an interesting plot twist.
I was kind of thinking, and again, I wanted to wait till I had a chance to talk with you on this. But we have a few other titans in regards to ocean, seas, rains, and whatnot. I was thinking that depending on how we end up doing, because even then, like we talked about the phases of the moon, the phases of the moon are going to be entirely different and not based on real world mechanics, because we're not going to have we still have a sun and we have the moons and all that, but they're not millions of miles away out in space. They're they're far closer, but they're doing this weird dimensional like shift. So I feel like we can add a lot of them there. Regardless, what I was thinking is a lot of Rialta's sisters, in essence, would have then taken it over, and then those different phases of the moon, you could have an earlier phase that starts with someone like either Silit moving on to Leveron and then ending up with like Drilak. So you have the phases of the Pearl Moon that move between Rialta's sisters. Then they kind of each govern a portion of that next phase, kind of taking on like you said, when she either abandoned or could no longer have dominion over that because she took over the stars, and that's going to take up the bulk of her time. I feel like they all kind of pitched in and said, okay, you take a piece, you take a piece, you take a piece, and we're going to go ahead and make this work. that kind of a thing is what I was thinking.
I like that idea. We did discuss last time that the moon might actually sink into the ocean.
We did. I wanted to revisit that, but
We're
yes,
not sold on that, and that still requires a lot of work. I like the idea of it phasing between the kingdoms. The thing is, if we have multiple moons, they don't all need to have phases. Not all, like maybe the blood moon has phases because it's undergoing the cycle of birth, life, death, and renewal because it is a source of lifeblood. But the pearl might not have phases. The pearl might just have an arc. Maybe the pearl has a changing arc, right? So it doesn't always rise in the same place. Maybe it sort of spirals around the world so that it moves through the sky in different patterns instead of going through phases. And we could still say that it's sort of being passed from Titan to Titan, or it could now fall under the rule of one of the water titans. I'm trying to see if there's anybody who'd be a really good candidate for that.
I'm pulling that up as well.
Yeah, we're both looking at that. We could also invent a new Titan or a demi-Titan. It could be like somebody who's a step below a Titan who's now in charge of that, which would put them in a precarious position.
I mean, we could do that, and I am totally open to that. I feel like going off of our previous water-aligned deities, Drikla would be most likely since they are the patient of deep water. They are calm, centered, and enlightened. They are all about death and secrets. I feel like a lot
That's
of that
the opposite of tides, though. That's the opposite of like tidal movement. You know, if Drikla is sort of still calm water.
No, but you have this the reason that the tides work is like we said, it's not that there's the churning of the moon moving and it's not based off gravity. We're making it a completely different thing. You were saying that it is drawn to the water energy, that the moon churns the tides because they are drawn to the water that is Liban. Liban is buried underneath Tamrian fighting against the flea for all.
So were there no tides before that happened?
I think it's because Liban was ever present that it's likely that Rialta was channeling the moon to basically follow the path of Liban, and that's why the tides were getting pulled around. Now that Liban is buried, you have this Titan of deep water. Because again, we've made Drikla the Titan of deep water, but also still lakes. So it kind of comes down to me, in essence, deep water would mean ocean or sea. It could be a very deep lake or river, but in my brain of brains, we don't have a actual Titan of the sea. To me, that kind of encompasses all of it. And what I'm thinking is that if you have to channel that energy to something buried deep, 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 deep below the water, which like Liban currently what we're saying is, you would need to have a patron that would be able to find them and then channel that energy and continue that if there's that effervescent struggle. Again, we really need to nail down exactly what's happening with the pearl. If the pearl is connecting itself via a Titan to the sovereign of water, we need to make sure that we establish that's what's happening. And if it is, why is that?
Well,
you know what I mean?
Let's work. There's a couple of Titans we can work with here. I think that, and we're going to definitely need to do an episode about these Titans later. Alikas is the keeper of the Wellsprings, like the underground water, right?
Water. I mean, the Wellsprings, I think that goes into all the elements, but yeah.
Right.
Certainly.
But specifically, the Wellsprings as imagined as springs, right? So even the non-water elements through the idea of welling up from below. Because Alikas is a Titan derived from Anacra, earth, and Liban, water, specifically. So I imagine Alikas as this patron of underground water and wells and springs and stuff like that. But that's a metaphysical concept that includes the elements rising up in general. And then Drikla is still water, deep water, calm lakes, etc. So what if Leveron, Drikla, and Alikas are sort of tossing the pearl back and forth?
Okay.
So when it sets, you know, it's sort of Drikla is between the two. Leveron is the mercurial deity of disasters, snow, and rain, but it makes sense that Leveron would also include storms in that and raging seas. So I'm thinking that you've got this stack, right, where you've got Leveron on the surface level, then you've got Drikla as like the deep waters of the ocean, and then you've got Alikas as like the underground deepest wellsprings. And so the three of them are sort of juggling the pearl between them. Leveron yeets it into the sky, Drikla catches it, and then Alikas like refreshes and restores it before handing it back to Leveron to pass it up into the sky once again. So we can create this almost three, and this isn't an exact, like, this is just how mortals try to understand what's going on with the pearl.
Yeah.
It's not a one-to-one. But it can create this mythology of three sister goddesses all participating in this process. So you've got these three moon goddesses, but they're all water goddesses, and two are also and then one of them is connected to air, because Leveron is another offspring like Raelta, an offspring of Vindur and of Liban, so air and water. Drikla is just an offspring of Liban, and Alikas is an offspring of earth and water. So you've got all the elements that are not fire have a hand in the pearl. And it creates this triad, which is great for religion and mystery and stuff like that, and culture building.
You know, it kind of goes along with what I was saying originally about the 3 cycles of the moon, each dictated by a different titan.
Mm-hmm.
And I like what you're going with. I like your metaphor with the geyser, because if we go with Leveron being the actual shooting geyser, we go with Drikla being like that calm, it's not, nothing's happening yet, and then we go for Alikas is the building of that water to be shot forth into the sky again. You can almost have it to where the seas themselves, or just water in general, is more erratic and more dangerous during the times of Leveron, and then it kind of cools out, and that's like you kind of take, instead of cycles of the moon, depending on which titan is currently in charge of the moon, it's like, oh, we don't go sailing during Leveron. That's a bad time. You just don't do that. You know, you either wait till Drikla, or maybe if Alikas is in charge, you might set out. But
if you need like speed, you need speed and power, but a little bit of control. Like Alikas has that upswelling energy, and so sailors who are, they're not desperate, but they're like, we need to haul ass, they would say prayers to Alikas for, along with the various winds that they want, for speed. Mariners and warriors of the sea would also want those Alikas tides in their favor. Like if you think about it, Leveron is the tides going out, Drikla is like the mid. So Leveron is high tide, Drikla is mid tide, and Alikas is low tide.
That would make sense.
I think that the reason why are they passing the pearl around is because the tides are important to cycling the waters of the world. It's part of a natural cycle. They're not just tossing it around for fun. There's a question from chat, like, why does the pearl matter? And I think
was actually going to step in for that one as well.
Go ahead. No. I'm talking a lot.
I was just going to say it's less, and yes, of course, like Joe was saying, it is important to make sure we keep the ball moving, as it were. But the main thing is that wasn't any part of these Titans' original domain. That was the realm, much like how, and we probably should talk about who ended up stepping in, or what entity stepped in for Ramius as the cupbearer of the sovereigns. Because when you have these beings that they're originally created with a purpose, much like everything in Anacra, there are wrenches that can be thrown into the cycle of things, and you have to deal with it and make it work. This is one of those things that when Rialta kind of abandoned her duties, someone had to step in and keep that going. And it's less about like, why is it important that they do this? And more like, they have so many domains together, not one of these gods would be able to step in and say, hey, this is mine now. It's a lot of work, which is why they're spreading it between the 3 of them to make sure that they can still keep and do their domains. They're just kind of working at 110% all the time to make sure that they can actually keep this thing going. It's a very important thing, like Joe was saying, and not one being is able to take it without giving up something else.
Right. And the reason the pearl is important is because the tides, the ebb and flow of the tides is essential to sort of keeping the ocean's ecosystem flowing naturally, and to keep those currents going.
It'd be like saying, what if the wind just stopped blowing? I mean,
yeah,
you can imagine what that's going to do to just the face of the world if just wind just stops. That's why we have 4 different gods dedicated to the wind.
Exactly. When the sovereigns assembled the mortal world, having life flourish in that world was part of that plan. And in order to facilitate that, they need the flow of the tides, almost like a circulatory system for the world. And Raelta was in a perfect position to take care of that. But the new solution is sort of a stopgap. It's a jury-rig solution to keep the tides going while all these titans multitask like crazy. I like it. I like it a lot.
You know, out of our big 3, we had Ramius skirk his duties to do something greater slash, you know, a sentence of sorts. We had Rialta kind of skirk her duties for the greater good. Is Ziliar going to end up having a, you know what, I just don't feel like doing this anymore, and I'm just gonna retire. I just don't want to be a part of this whole thing.
No, Zaliar is the titan of the sun. He's the sun rider. He guides the sun across the sky, every single day.
Well, that's what I mean. Is he going to
Right.
just decide, I don't feel like doing this anymore?
Not in lore. Even all the way up to thousands of years after Quest of the Book of Dawn, Zalar is still doing his thing. The thing is, though, Zalar is one of the people who has one of the bigger religions. Zalar's only distraction is fighting infernals and spreading the faith of Zalar, the Phoenix god, across the mortal world in order to oppose the infernals and their ilk wherever they go. So Zalar's the kid who, all right, his sister ran off to join the Peace Corps, and his brother vanished under mysterious circumstances, like just got super into religion. No, didn't get super into religion.
He went underground.
His brother went underground, right? He does undercover work. So Zalar's a kid who, like, with his family falling apart, just doubled down on being the good kid and doing the right thing and got really religious. So, like, in the face of both of these people fundamentally changing their nature, Zalar did not fundamentally change his nature. He doubled down on who he is.
He wanted to make sure to keep the family Minecraft server alive.
Exactly. Speaking of which, the sun is kind of a moon in a way. It's, in my opinion, it's not that different cosmologically from a moon. It occupies the same sort of space in the universe. It's between the Sky Kingdom and the firmament, and it is a huge ball of fire. It is an alternate fire source. You've got the underworld with the wellsprings of fire there, but the sun operates very similarly, in my opinion. And it's got some life energy coming out of it as well. It's almost like a direct port to it's almost like a direct port to the underworld. It's its own wellspring of fire and life. And the reason it's there is because the natural flow in the original design, the natural flow of elements upwards through the earth wasn't going to get enough vital energy and warmth to the surface. It's like when you're running the oven and the broiler at the same time in order to get maximum, cooking efficiency. So
do you do that?
No, I don't. But there are oven designs.
You should do that.
There are oven designs that do that, though, like toaster ovens and stuff with multiple heat sources to ensure even cooking. So it was important that they get that sunlight and that fire energy out there to keep life going amidst everything else. So the sun was part of the original design of the world. It's basically the fire moon in its own way. So there isn't a moon that governs fire. You have the sun instead. And Zalar, the titan of the sun rider, the phoenix god, holds on to the thing and steers it through the sky. It doesn't it's not like he's providing the votive energy to make it fly, but he is the one guiding it on its course throughout the day.
Mate, you've kind of touched on a thing that I wanted to get to. We had a few topics we wanted to move through during this episode. You kind of stumbled onto what do all moons have in common? And I feel like the mainstay is that there is a titan or other being in control of them. Is there anything else that we know of in regards to the moons that have a particular goal or theme in common?
Well, you can't just yeet a piece of rock into the sky and have it fly. That's not how that works. There are no orbital mechanics do not work in Anacra. So a non-magical piece of dirt will never, or earth will never orbit. It always has to have a magical energy source of some kind. That magical energy source always radiates down to the world below, to the mortal world. All the moons orbit, again, at the upper reaches or in that border between the firmament, the edge of reality, and the Sky Kingdom. One of the things is the blood moon doesn't have anybody steering it. The blood moon is sort of on its own magical momentum path. Crozan. But it does have all these archfey dwelling on it. There is no dedicated titan of the blood moon, which makes it a bit of a wild card, which is why it's associated with lunacy and the wild fae and dancing maniacally under the moonlight, because it is the unguided moon in its own way. But it is a massive source of vital energy, which is why it's able to maintain its orbit out there.
I guess what I meant is we do have archfey that are kind of guiding it, or at least like the stewards of it. So you have these, even if you're not an actual god, whenever you meet a being that's like an archfey on their own turf, they kind of have like control over their domain, so they become maybe like kind of demigod like. What I
Hmm.
mean is you have very powerful figures. You don't just have a, like you said, a rock that you throw into space and then someone just jumps on there and goes, "Hi, I'm Ogre Man in control of this moon and I'm a
Hmm.
god now." You have to have a very powerful source getting it there in the first place, and then
Hmm.
likely there, it's not just floating on its own. There is something with stewardship over it.
Right. And again, the Blood Moon doesn't have, it has multiple Archfey on it, and it's contested, and it's unruled and unruly, but it is a supernatural place, and beings that have made it their home do have a connection to it. They can't alter its course. The Blood Moon, again, it's the wild moon, but it's wild in that it follows its own course that was like the Titans put a ton of energy, and Sovereigns put a ton of energy into setting it on its course. So no one Archfey who dwells there can change the course and direction of the moon, but by dwelling there, it does become their home. It is a supernatural place, and they do become part of it, so it becomes their domain, even if there's a ton of little subdomains on it. But yeah, every single moon is a supernatural place imbued with supernatural entity, and whoever dwells there is going to be a bad customer one way or another.
Another one we had was, are there other non-star celestial bodies? We know we have just, we're lousy with stars in Anacra. And again, stars not being actual balls of fire in the sky. They're more like entities that have then taken on the radiance of becoming a celestial.
Mhm.
And much like you know, a barrel of buzzing hornets, they fly around the outskirts of Anacra and make sure that
Mhm.
big bad voodoo things don't come in and try and take the blood and the good stuff that's in the center of this cookie jar.
Mhm. So let's talk about what other celestial bodies you would have, specifically, not so much with regards to our real world astronomy, but I'm more inspired by things like medieval astrology and medieval cosmology. So people care a lot about planets. In a lot of medieval magic and occultism, planets were super important. Now, our world can't really sustain planets the way that you'd have. Like, if you go to the Forgotten Realms, for example, the Forgotten Realms actually exists as part of a solar system. There are other planets in that system. Sure, the sun isn't just a thermonuclear explosion, there's some magic going on, but space is a thing, and there are gigantic other worlds you can explore in that reality. Anacra does not have that. The moons are, they exist and you can go there, and they are subworlds of their own, but they're much smaller than our world's moon. They're much, much smaller.
What you're really getting with the, in regards to the multiple planes of existence or worlds, is the different kingdoms within Anacra. You don't have
Yeah.
multiple planets in this like little solar system. They're all interconnected. And rather than having to take a ship over to Jupiter or Mars, you can then just pop over, you find a crossing point and bam,
Hmm.
you're in the underworld, you're in the overworld. And that's an entirely different planet in essence and of its own.
Now, one of the important things, if I recall, one of the original words for planet meant wandering star, because the ancients spent a lot of time looking up at the heavens. And they noticed that the stars were regular. They came up with constellations, which is something we're going to talk about in a moment, chat.
Yep.
But
I
the
was
thing
just
about
going
the
to say.
planets is that the planets were on a totally different like cycle. They didn't move with the stars, they moved on their own, which is why a lot of astrology and occultism has to do with, oh, this planet is in this constellation because the planets move. So from we don't have an answer yet. We're going to be just making this up live right now as to, do we have something like that in Anacra, and if so, what is it? I have some ideas, but I want to throw it across to you first if you have anything in mind.
So here's the thing. I think that constellations absolutely should be a thing. How we go about it, because again, we don't have the same kind of fixed planetoids that would then stand in for what we're looking for. What I'm thinking though, and this is something we actually talked about in our celestial episode, is that we have sentries. The celestials that are out there, unless you're a messenger, you are standing post and you are, for hundreds, if not millenniums, you are watching the outer dark to make sure
Mm-hmm.
that nothing pushes into an aqua. So I'm thinking that yes, we have constellations, but it's not the kind of fixed thing that you'll see for thousands upon thousands of years. You'll have a set of constellations or even a particular constellation that will morph and change over time. Likewise, I think the closest thing you get to shooting stars in an opera would be these messengers, the different celestials that either move between the centuries, passing information, or coming down onto the mortal plane or otherwise in an opera in
Mm-hmm.
order to inform the important mortals that they maybe have to deal with, or more likely high level beings like gods or other deities. And that's really what a lot of the constellations, the star charts, and things are going off of, is these celestial bodies that are actually angels, basically, in the sky.
Actual celestial bodies. There's a couple different types of constellations. Again, the most of the big celestials you're going to see when you look up at the night sky, everyone has their watch post where they're assigned to stand guard. And there are some formations that are deliberate, like deliberate arrangements of the celestials. Whether that is to imbue some meaning to the people down below, I'm not sure yet. It might just be a strategic formation. So there are constellations that are deliberate, that the celestials themselves recognize. They're like, I'm part of this celestial battalion. I'm part of this celestial watch force. You know, we're an organized unit dedicated to protecting this part of the firmament, so we're in a formation. But there's also, just when you've got so many stars, different cultures will start to link, you know, draw shapes in the sky, which is what happens in our real world. So you've got deliberate constellations on the part of the court of stars that are assigned by them, and then you've got constellations that each culture looks up and makes up on their own, because
Exactly.
those constellations, the official ones, that's not something that some angel's going to come down and be like, I'm going to teach you all the battalions of the holy host, you know, this is an important religious thing that I'm going to share with you. No, they don't care. They're just there to do their job, to protect the universe. It's not like the constellations have a holy meaning to the celestials in most cases. That tends to be a meaning assigned by earthly cultures.
Now, what I will do, mate, I did want to kind of give you another idea here, and I completely agree with you. You're not going to have sentries, whether it's messengers or otherwise, that are like, hey, by the way, mortals, did you know that even though you call us the dragon constellation, we're actually, and they get into like, this is what we have. They don't have that kind of vanity that they really care about. What you do have, though, is that even though the common person, the layman, wouldn't know, you have, whether it's more than likely clerics and priests of Rialta, who very likely need to know who they're interacting with. You would have, much like how a lot of these scholars or the sages of Anacra probably have a pretty good idea the true origins, or at least they're close to it. You have a lot of these priests and members of Rialta's faith that are in the know about what the different actual technical
Yeah,
names are.
absolutely.
Because
Absolutely
they
agree.
may need to get in contact with one of those celestial guardsmen.
And in that case, knowing the celestials, knowing the names of the stars in the constellation would absolutely be important. I completely agree. You've got different cultural appellations for the stars, but there are people who are capable of communication who know the truth. It's not like the deep, dark, secret truth of the universe, but that information is out there. Let's move from there to talk about planets. I have two ideas for what planets could be. One, planets could be celestials that are mobile, whose job it is to move from, maybe they have instead of being a sentry, they're on patrol. They have a patrol route that they follow.
Yes. Yeah.
Or they could just be like, I'm moving from battalion to battalion to keep an eye on people and be a troubleshooter, stuff like that. So that's one option for planets, and they would tend to be in some cases brighter than others because they don't fight in a formation with others. They need to be pretty tough on their own, so they would have a lot of radiance to them. The other
I like the idea, instead of having like an Orion's belt or like a big little dipper, like, you know how we have very specific, like you can find these up in the sky, that you have these moving stars that kind of will go from constellation to constellation, and depending on where they go, they change the makeup of the stars, at least to the mortals, and they kind of go, oh, this constellation is changing into this one because these two stars are in the same area at the same, that kind of a thing. You know, you have these moving constellations.
And they don't move often, but they do move.
No.
Like they might need
Yeah.
to change formation depending on the threats. And so I think one of the main uses of astrology in Anacra is not to try to predict the future or identify people's, personalities and stuff like that. It's to determine how much danger the universe is in, right? Like if the stars are changing, either stars are being killed by some awful threat from the hungry dark, or they are altering their formation to deal with some awful threat from the hungry dark, or maybe a refugee rescue operation, right? And so their time scale, because they're near immortal, is different from ours. So the stars don't change much, but they change more often than they do in the real world compared to the ancients. And it might be reform the line, or it might be planets moving, coming and going. And I do think that the planets would have different names. People would identify them, and they would use the movement of the planets to determine how things are going along the firmament. And so, yeah, the stars can foretell a prophecy of doom, but it's not because they have seen the future and they're trying to warn us about it. It's because, holy shit, there's another giant space fleet from nowhere attacking. If all the stars start to gather around one spot in the sky, you know something is up. Something big is happening. Yeah. And so prophets and scholars on the world below would look at that and go, oh, crap. Okay, in ages past, has any great evil been associated with that particular patch up there?
Yeah. Exactly. It's less like oh, the stars had foretold, and more like, oh, there's our warning signal, guys.
We're not really big on prophecy in Anacra. We're not really big on predestination or fate. We're much more into signs as actual indicators and prophecies as a set of if-then-else conditions.
Conditions, exactly. Mm-hmm. It's not to say there aren't prophecies in Anacra. There are tons of prophecies in Anacra, but it's less like, oh, this child born under this moon is destined to rule the worlds, and it's less of that and more like, oh yeah, if you raise a child to be this way or the other, and based on the prophecy, if you kind of see that as a recipe of sorts, yeah, absolutely. If you make Adonis and Adonis goes to a beauty pageant, they're probably going to win. You know?
That's a great way of putting it. There aren't a lot of chosen ones in Anacra the way that you would get a chosen one in other media. A chosen one could be somebody who, like, well, you just happened to be born with incredibly powerful magic, but it's not because you have been chosen to lead the Great Rebellion or to fulfill the special thing. It's because of the circumstances of your birth. But that being said, given that you have all this power, there's a good chance you're going to do something with it. And so prophecies tend to work that way a lot more. We try to avoid the whole "you are special because we have decided you are special" thing.
Hey, wait, why am I special? Well, you're the main character. What does that mean? Well, you're the point of view character, and the book, your story is about you, and you must do great things. It's like, but I am a farmer. Doesn't matter, moisture farmer. Get out there and save the galaxy. Okay.
What else? There is another possibility for planets, though, and that is smaller moons. Like, we could have a ton of moons up there that are just really, really small and have their own unique magical properties.
Really?
Yeah. I mean,
I'm not opposed to it. I just love how we went from, Matt, I only want one moon. I think the option of two moons is a little bit far-fetched, but I'm willing to entertain it. And now we have a million tiny moons that are just floating around up there.
So here's the thing, right? You've got fantasy worlds, you've got Dragonlance, where the moons, you know, there's these visible moons, and then there's the dark moon that no one can see, and they're incredibly important to the balance of power. And then you've got Skyrim. You've got, what's the world of Skyrim called again? Do you remember what the world of Skyrim is called?
It's not the right. I'm thinking of a word, and it's not the right one.
The world of the Elder Scrolls. Yes. It's on the tip of my tongue. But like, you look up at the sky, and it's lousy with moons. It's like you're looking at a freaking nebula sky. I think that's beautiful, but
damn it, I was right. Tamriel, son of
Tamriel, Nirn, Tamriel. Yeah. I think Tamriel's the continent, and Nirn is the world. Yeah,
you're probably right. Yeah.
Chat's chiming in. So they're lousy with moons, like just tons and tons of cosmic moons, and that is what I am less looking for in our world, in my opinion. So and that's just an aesthetic thing, really, more than anything else. It's purely aesthetic. So if we have small micro moons that just look like bright stars, maybe a weird green star, right? They can be different colors. That appeals to my aesthetic, because you've got all these, you know, lights in the sky. I'm down with that without having these gigantic mega moons flying over our head.
I am also down with that.
Yeah, it's just my desire for not having a million moons is largely aesthetic more than it is philosophical.
And like we've said, I kind of feel like, for the most part, when you look up at the night sky, you're not going to see both the blood moon and the pearl. You can, absolutely, and there's definitely a lot of crossover, but it's not like you always have just this one giant moon on the horizon and then this little moon just kind of peeking around. You know how video games like to do that thing where you have like big moon and then you have like little moon like up in the front right here, and they always try and get that shot every time, and they want to make it look like the planets are aligning, and absolutely that can happen, but I feel like a lot less more often you have them shifting around to where, yes, they show up together, but not as often as, you know, every box art would have you believe, you know?
I also think that the blood moon looks like the moon, and the pearl looks like a really big star.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't look like the moon looks like a planetoid. When you look up at the moon, you're like, that's a planetoid. That's what that looks like. But to me, the
Yeah.
pearl just looks like, you know, if a star is a pinprick, the pearl looks like a thumbnail. It's not nearly as big as the blood moon, but it's just a really brighter than the North Star in my idea.
Also, and we haven't really talked about this, but I wanted to bring it up at some point. I
Mm-hmm.
like the idea of over time, the blood moon gets to the point where instead of being this bright, shiny, good-looking moon,
Mm-hmm.
we've even said, the astral winds blowing over the blood moon or the bone moon, as it were, and it's
Mm-hmm.
created this kind of weird, like dusty, ashy bone
Mm-hmm.
covering across the planescape of it. But even then, it's filled with bone, and or if it's filled with blood, and you have bone and you have blood. And I feel like over time, that blood would kind of sink into the bone, and then you have
Mm-hmm.
this almost like this underlayer to where the moon looks almost rusted over time.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it would take a long time, or you would even have all these fae. I mean, eh, I figure you have so many different fae that are up there. Over time, they're probably going to bring stuff with them, and
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have what started off as this pure white moon, and over time, you end up with old man teeth, and like it has like yellowed in certain parts, and maybe it's got a cavity here and there, and the moon starts
Mm-hmm.
to look not janky, but over time, you're probably going to have less this pristine, beautiful blood and bone moon, and the Fae are going to f it up over time, and not destroy it, but you've got basically squatters that are up
Mm-hmm.
there in control of it.
I
You're
like
going to
the
have
idea
dead cities and
of it
stuff in time.
changing. Like over time it changes and there's a great war and they tear a gash in it and so there's a big red scar of like blood flowing
Ooh,
openly across it.
yeah.
And then the winds pick up and they like bring the bone across it and it turns like sparkly white again. It's changing. It's not constant. By all
Yeah, that sounds
means.
sick.
I agree with that. I think that is pretty darn cool. We had a question from chat. Are mortals aware of the true nature of prophecies? If so, are there any who try to game the system by trying to fulfill its conditions? Yes, and yes. Now
Yep,
that being
absolutely.
said, the game masters have spoken and said that prophecy is not inevitable. There are forces that are inevitable. Whether or not the design is inexorable
God, I knew
is
you were going to say that.
left as it's left as a plot point for later on. But there are humans, there are mortals of all sorts. Because keep in mind, Matt and I are telling you all this, but we're not talking to the people who live in our world. They don't understand things the way that we do behind the scenes. They're just sort of left to figure things out on their own. And yeah, there are gods you can talk to and people who will fill you in on things, but everyone has a different understanding of the world regardless. There are still cultures that believe in fate. They believe that even if in our level of understanding there is no fate, at a higher level there actually is fate and destiny. It just operates by giving us all these apparent free choices. It's going to vary culture by culture. Some places believe in inevitable prophecy. They believe in predestination. They don't even believe in free will, or they believe that if you're fighting fate, fate is going to push back. These beliefs are going to vary all over the place. Some of the dragon tribes of Elam believe very, very heavily in fate. Some people in Cost, some certain families, especially of the fifth house, believe in fate. Now, a lot of members of the fifth house of Cost believe in fortune, which is different from fate. It's almost like a heresy amongst them. And Matt, you're sort of the arbiter of Cost, but this is something that pops up from place to place and from culture to culture.
Also, I mean, when it comes down to it, fundamentally, you've got mortal people who are in charge of the history and the lore of their
Mm-hmm.
worlds. And people lie. People are prideful.
Mm-hmm.
People may stumble onto an answer that they like and they just say that it's correct. And yes, you could go double check it with an entity that would be able to, but it's likely either time consuming, expensive, or it would prove you wrong. And people in power don't want to be wrong, and they want to share what they think their truth is with the world. And eventually you can have a lie become more widespread and profound than the actual truth. So
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have messes in and about Anacra where people are not always going to be as well informed as they probably could or should be,
And different
just because people suck.
Exactly. And like Matt and I know the origin story of the world of Anacra, but every culture has their own version. And usually because there is a central truth of what actually happened, most cultures are tied, at least they have a version of that story. It's not like they have a completely different story, right? But they all have their own different versions of the creation myth and of their own origins. Now, going more back to the original question,
Oh,
yeah.
also, real quick, when it comes down to it as well, even the sovereigns and the titans, they're closer to the Greek gods, the Greek pantheon, in regards to their own thoughts, feelings, pride, and whatnot. Yes, they are a not higher level. That's not that's the word I'm using, but I don't literally mean more stats. What I mean is they're kind of elevated and
Right. They
enlightened in a
understand
sense.
things on a level that mortals don't. They're
But
connected
if you
to reality and truth in a way that mortals are not.
But if you were going to ask Vinder, like if you somehow got an audience with Vinder and asked him about what he thought of the past, versus if you ask someone like Sin or even Ramius or one of the other Titans, you're going to get a very similar but very different answer based off of what their opinion or perspective on it was. So even in different cultures, depending on who they worship, you're going to have differing stories just because of the way, like if I was to tell Joe something, Joe was to tell somebody something, and it goes on and so forth, playing telephone, whatever ends up getting to the third or fourth person is not going to be the same as what I said.
Now, all that being said, yes, there are mortals who understand the nature of prophecy. And yes, if a mortal hears of a prophecy, you know how in Greek myth, there's this thing, we're going to draw in Greek myth again here. In Greek myth, if you hear a prophecy, that crap is coming true and you cannot stop it. And half the time, if you try to stop it from coming true, the efforts you take to prevent it from coming true are going to be what causes it to come true.
Almost as if it was inexorable.
Yeah, it's inexorable. Most of the time, that's not how it works in Anacra. Instead, so when you hear a prophecy, you usually can prevent it. You can't like remove that mechanism from the world, but you know, if the prophecy is anybody who holds this sword and goes to this place and speaks these words will get the prize, well, then you can kill anyone who tries that, or you can break the sword. Now, it's possible
a new see from Vinder that works most of the time, but sometimes it totally screws him over, and he thinks, "Let me just smite any fool who might give the prophecy going," and then you totally misinterpret it, and it happens anyway, and you're like, "Ah, dang it, I goofed."
Literally, the example we're working with here, chat, is Vinder trying to prevent the ascension of new star gods. He has successfully prevented the succession of many star gods through his violence. But sometimes he misses, and his attempts to do so sometimes get him in trouble. And when it gets him in trouble, it's not like, oh, you went against fate and now fate is going to punish you. It's more like you picked a fight with these people, and now these people are fighting back because they don't like that you're trying to smite them, because they don't understand that you're trying to stop this prophecy from happening. It's just normal action-reaction consequences. Now, he hasn't found a way to delete the prophecy, delete the conditions that allow the ascension of new star gods, but you know, he's definitely he's like wiped out entire cultures to stop it from happening, and sometimes it works. And
likewise, you probably have intervention by other titans, maybe even sovereigns or other beings that have stepped in, and when he tries to go with smiting, they kind of go, "Yo, man, you've really wiped out a lot of civilizations from existence, and you got to stop this stuff. Like, we've got, again, we don't love followers and stuff. Like, it's not like we need those things, but like, people look up to us, they pray to us, they want to make sure that we can help and protect them, and you can't keep doing this stuff." So they have, at the very least, petitioners from other godly beings, if not straight up intervention.
Yeah, bro, please chill, please.
Don't tase me, bro.
We had a question in chat earlier. Any artificial moons? I would argue that the blood moon is an artificial moon, even though it was created by the Titans. As of yet, that has not happened. No Infernal has attempted to create their own evil moons. Is it in the realm of possibility? Absolutely.
It could already be that there may be one or more up there, and they just haven't been activated yet.
I mean,
just because it's not in play doesn't mean it's not there.
We threw out the idea that there could be tiny moons, and any of those tiny moons we discussed
would sound pretty artificial, yeah.
Right? And those would definitely exist below the firmament and above the Sky Kingdom. Like, in order to count as a moon, it has to be in that sort of sphere. So they could be, you know, maybe Uzul's launching an entire satellite network of these evil moons that are going to form a sigil across the sky, and when the time is right, he will activate them. But if that's the case, nobody knows about it yet.
Also, that would be a huge bit of work, because you're looking at mortals having to do that, since the Infernals can't come there and do it themselves. They have to grant powers to people who can, and that doesn't usually go unnoticed.
Yep.
Mate, we've got about 5 minutes or so. Not saying we have to close out, but is there anything that you wanted to cover that we haven't quite gotten to yet?
Well, comets, do they exist before the second day?
Well, if you were going to ask Matt from last episode, do comets exist? Matt had a pretty decent idea about how comets could exist. And it involved eggs and ogres.
What?
But you don't remember?
No, I don't.
where we had ogres that would jump into space rocks from the
Oh, right. But
overworld.
those are meteorites, not comets. The space ogres from space are a form of meteorite. Here's another thing about that. Shooting stars, a shooting star occurs anytime something is descending from the firmament layer to a lower layer. Like,
See, I thought we had established that would be messengers from the celestial bodies.
it could be anything. Like, if something broke through the firmament, it could be a shooting star. If a celestial dies in combat, it could be a shooting star. A shooting star specifically is something descending from the firmament layer to lower layers. It's just like this aura, this light that gets created as part of that transition. So I'm thinking, yes, messengers look like shooting stars, but literally anything coming down from the heavens looks like a shooting star. And the bigger it is and the more violent its descent, the bigger and brighter that shooting star is. And an actual meteorite that strikes Anacra has to be something that falls from that layer or a similar layer and makes it all the way down, including space ogres.
That there's a couple of just ne'er-do-well celestials that are just up in the celestial bodies. Like, you know, when you go on top of like a really tall building and you're like, hey, let's drop a penny and see if it hits anybody.
Yeah. No, I like
that wouldn't be a thing, but I think it's hilarious.
Mm. Or like a celestial fights and their sword shatters in the battle, but they live. Well, the pieces of that sword could rain down as shooting stars. Gnomes probably did ride a comet to Anacra. That is probably a thing that happened. Now, but comets are huge and bright, and in the real world, they don't fall to our world. They're just passing through. We might want to leave that as a mystery for another episode for the time being.
Probably a good idea.
Yeah, like we have a sort of a specific role for what comets entail in our world, but they are massive things that are passing through, is what we'll say for the time being.
And I feel like you have, again, like you said, there's less and less of that happening the more celestials you have up there, because I feel like those kind of things would happen, like you said, if there was a fallen soldier, or rather sentry, or if you had something come through. But I feel like at this point, it's very rare that things get through. But it still can happen. I just feel like it's a lot less meteor showers or whatnot, and more like a singular thing.
Right. And most meteors you're going to see, most shooting stars you're going to see are somebody deliberately coming down from the firmament or somebody dying in battle rather than something from outside getting in. But that is one of the nice things, is that when something gets in from the outside, it usually leaves that shooting star trace, which astronomers on the world below are on the lookout for. And Vindur in Terra Nimbus, with his gigantic telescope on top of his cloud, like, people will see. It's hard for something to sneak into Anacra these days.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. It doesn't happen often, and when it does, it's
noticeable
pretty quickly. Yeah, you got to get up pretty early in the multiverse to get into Anacra.
I think that's getting close to wrapping it up. Last chance for questions from chat. And Matt, can you think of anything else about moons or other celestial bodies that would need to be addressed?
No, but I think the one thing I want to quickly cover, just because we kind of glossed over it, we didn't really talk about someone in chat asked earlier about creatures, and we talked about it for the blood moon. We didn't really talk about the landscape or what could inhabit the pearl moon. And I think just really quickly, you said it looked like a pearl and was just like a shining star, but we really didn't cover if this moon was anything more than an energy source, or if it literally is just, much like you talked about how, like, you know, our sun isn't a giant explosion that was given form and shape. What are your thoughts on the pearl moon?
I think it's an actual pearl, a magical actual pearl. I think things could live there. There could be water on the pearl or inside the pearl. I think you meet water fae, you meet water elementals. It's definitely an alien sort of place. But I like the idea of it being coated in water, or having water in it, and having supernatural water entities around it.
So here was my thought. I was thinking, since originally Rialza, born both of Vinder and Liban, was the one who originally was in charge and probably put that thing in place, it likely had been pulled both from the elemental wells of water and air, merged together, given form, and shunted out into space. And I'm thinking that it's kind of, in essence, almost like ice or glass orb of sorts with
Mm.
the stuff inside of it. And it basically acts almost as a focus or conduit for
Mhm.
that energy. That's what it was originally kind of used for. And then over time, it may have taken on different effects. But my thought here is that it's basically pure elemental air and water made ice. And it's basically like an ice pearl up in the sky, and everything instead of being on it is inside it, kind of like how we have the underworld as like an inside out ball
Mhm.
kind of a thing. I think that the pearl is very much the same.
This glass, ice, pearly outside
Yes,
and a watery inside with some sort of fantastic little mermaid looking kingdom inside of it.
that is exactly what I'm thinking. Yes.
Mhm. Dope. So if you land on the pearl, one, you will freeze to death. And two, getting inside is a challenge. But if you get inside, there's this miraculous Atlantis looking thing going on in there with all sorts of supernatural, beautiful creatures. I like that a lot. Any closing, if it was a pearl, what creature polished it? Raelta, the star goddess. Well, she's now the star goddess.
Yeah.
She used to
Before
be
she
the
was like a
moon.
Twilight moon goddess kind of a thing. Yeah.
But she had a career change, and now she's the warrior princess of the Outer Dark. I think that's going to wrap us up. Matt, did you have anything else you wanted to bring up?
That was it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, chat, as always, for your awesome involvement. We are doing an episode next week? Yeah, we're doing
I
it.
thought we were.
Yeah, we're
Yeah.
doing an episode next week. We're on next week. So,
And next week on the docket, by the way, is the sovereigns, their duties and their wonders.
awesome. Perfect. So, not that we haven't talked about that, but we're going to go into a deeper dive. So, everybody.
And really what we're pushing for is we had chat ask about what they specifically did before characters like Liban went away, Irakora went away,
Mhm.
Sin hasn't yet, but eventually goes away. Spoilers for those who don't know this.
Mhm.
There are things that happened during their tenure that we really want to delve into, and I think this would be a good chance to do it.
Indeed. Well, thank you, chat, for joining us. As always, you can ask us questions about the lore of the Four Kingdoms of Anacra on our Discord channel. This will be up on YouTube later. It might turn into a podcast at some point, since that's an easier way to digest it, but it's definitely on YouTube. Thank you for watching. Have an excellent day. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Joe.